out to me. And that was a mistake by the archivist. And so while I was waiting for the correct box to come, I said, what is this box? So I was looking for the box C, and instead the box E came. And so I said, okay, I'll open the box E and see what's there. And I start going through these files, and there's a file that says, End of Civil War, and it's thick. And I thought, well, why do you need a thick file for the end of the Civil War? This is an obvious thing. The war ends, Lee surrenders to Grant on April 9, 1965, we're done. And so I opened the file, and I started going through the records. Now, this was in 2003, and I'm going through these records, and they would lay the kernel of what would become this book, but I wouldn't decide to write this book for another, 10 plus years. But the context matters too, that 2003 context, because this is literally days, just days. I'm going through this set of files where this person from the War Department was given the task of identifying what the actual true end date of the war is. Was it April 9 or was it some other date? And just a few days before, President George W. Bush had given a speech on USS Abraham Lincoln, where he had declared that combat operations in Iraq were over. And behind him was a banner that said, Mission Accomplished. It becomes known as the Mission Accomplished speech. And it's not quite fair to President Bush to sort of make fun of him for that, because it really is the case that that was not by design. That was there because the people on that ship were their deployment had come to an end. But nonetheless, he does say the combat operations is over. That becomes the end of the Iraq War in May of 2003. And it's marked as the end in certain documents. This despite the fact that the war in Iraq would go on for many years, and we knew it would go on for many years in May of 2003. So here I am thinking about ends of wars. How do you, can a president actually declare a war over? Who does actually get to say that the war is over? Anyone. And so I'm thinking about these questions, and I'm going through this file, and it turns out that this very same question had occupied this official in the War Department who had been given this task. Now, why had he been given this task? Now that becomes relevant. So the issue at hand was Civil War pensions. And there had been people who had applied for a Civil War pension, and they had not joined the Army as volunteers until early 1866. And so the question was, how could they possibly be Civil War soldiers if they hadn't joined until early 66? Who is a Civil War soldier? It should be someone who served during the period of the war. And actually listening to Mark talk about Civil War graves and thinking about, well, who's a Civil War veteran? It should be someone who served during the war. Great, when's the war? So you need this is one reason why you need start dates and end dates, to identify who actually served in the war. For pensions, this matters a great deal, because by the 1890s, a system had evolved. Actually, it's in the Department of the Interior, because at that time, that's who did pensions. And the question is, which war did you serve in if you're applying for a pension? And Civil War, being a combat veteran of the Civil War, would give you the highest pension. So, this person is given the task. Do these people, are they eligible for a Civil War pension? And so, this fellow, whose name is Grant, he's no relation to Ulysses Grant, writes, he starts taking notes, and it becomes a set of a thick file of documents in which he writes that the war does not end as the War Department had been saying it ended in the spring of 1865. Now here's an irony. The man who's writing this and trying to figure this out, whose name is Lewis Grant, had been at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th. He had been there during the surrender. He hadn't been in the room, but he was outside. And so for him, this was something of a discovery to learn, and then he starts writing notes in these pages of these things, that there are battles that occur after April 9th. There are surrenders that occur after April 9th. There's fighting that occurs that might not be called battles, but it's certainly fighting. Guerrilla warfare continues well into 1865, and depending on how you want to define guerrilla warfare, continues well into 1866 and beyond. You don't have a declaration of an end of war until late 1866, and I'll come to that later. Why is there a declaration? You don't have Congress acknowledging an end of war until 1871. So actually this turns out to be kind of complicated. And I would say this question of when a war ends is almost always complicated. And so even the most famous wars we think of, and we can come up with images in our head, I can assure you that if you press hard on that end point, that end date, you'll find that the actual end date is actually complicated and tells a story in itself. I'll come back to this image because it's taken from a famous painting. And the painting matters. And the image is from Lincoln on the ship, the River Queen, about 10 days before the surrender of Appomattox. This is a remarkable moment because Lincoln has left the White House, and he didn't leave the White House very often, and when he did, it was only for a few days. That's true of presidents of all the 1800s and the 1700s. They tended not to leave the White House. They didn't campaign outside the White House. So Lincoln leaves, and he will not come back for 2 weeks. This is the longest he'll ever leave. And he goes because he believes he's going to oversee the end of the war. And what he's doing in this image is he's on board a steamship that has left Washington, gone down to Chesapeake, come up to James, and he's at the headquarters at City Point. This is where Grant's headquarters are. City Point at that time is a bustling metropolis of sorts, of a military sort, with lots of boats on the wharves, railroads. And Lincoln was in a side-wheeler like this, although this is not the River Queen. And this becomes his office away from Washington. And it's there that he will meet with the top brass, if you will, on board the River Queen in this painting meeting that was then captured by the painter G.P.A. Healy, George P.A. Healy, in 1868. The painting is called The Peacemakers because what the artist is trying to convey is Lincoln's conversation with these three top people. They are talking about the peace to come. We're in late March, and the question that's being discussed, there's a number of questions, but what is to be done if and when the major Confederate armies begin to surrender? I could have a contest to see if you can name everyone in this picture. I'm guessing many of you will know that. That's Ulysses Grant. This is Sherman in profile. So, and this is David Dixon Porter, the chief admiral. So what you basically have is the head of the armies of the West, head of the armies of the East, actually really the head of all armies, general-in-chief, and the head of the navies in the East, at least. So they're meeting, and it is in this meeting, just to give a couple things that are discussed. One of the things that's discussed is what to do with Jefferson Davis if he's ever captured. He's the president of the Confederacy. Is he going to be tried? Might he get the death penalty? What are you going to do with him? They talk a little bit about that. I'm not going to tell you what they said unless you ask in the questions, in which case I'm perfectly happy to answer questions. And I'll be done here in about 30 minutes or less, so I hope you do have questions. Should be less. Then The real question that they're talking about is, what kind of terms do we offer the Confederates? And here's where Lincoln says something really important, where he says, we should let them up easy. Just let them up easy. And this is an expression that comes from wrestling. Lincoln had been a wrestler as a young man and had won over communities, not only with his talent as a wrestler, but his sportsmanship, where when you have your person down and you've clearly beat them, you let them up easy. And in letting them up easy, you don't humiliate them, you don't taunt them, you don't hit them more than you have to, or you don't hit them at all. And thus, by letting them up easy, you have reconciliation. And that's the message that he's giving his commanders. Now, we know what's coming, which is a surrender, which is known mainly for its generosity. This is the surrender of Lee and the generous terms that Grant gives. And so this is a context for that Lincoln has set this up. But what I want to make sure you understand is that it didn't have to be this way. That there were many who said, no, 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 we should be as harsh as possible on the Confederates. In the summer of 1865, months after this scene, Richard Henry Dana of Massachusetts would give this speech that would become famous, in which he would say that we should hold the enemy in a grasp of war until we get from them absolute security that there can never be more fighting and that that there is security in the country. So here we have these kind of two metaphors from physical fighting. Sort of let them up easy, grasp of war, and you hold your enemy until they've given you whatever is needed for security. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, that would mean pledges, especially what Dana meant. What Dana was going for there is the states had to commit not only to emancipation, but to civil rights for African Americans and also voting rights for black men. So these are the kind of things that, for Dana at least, were important. But these issues are not being discussed in the room that you see here. So then we do get, later on, 10 days later roughly, we get to Appomattox. This is a famous scene. There's many images of this scene. There's been an opera done of Appomattox. There's a scene of the Appomattox surrender in Spielberg's 2012 film, Lincoln. This image just happens to be one that is famous for all sorts of reasons. I think it's a really good image. It's the 100th anniversary. It's done in 1965. And it shows you all these people in the room. Some of the people in the picture were not in the room. This is a commonality with lots of images of Appomattox. There are people who the artist put in the room that were not there. Grant famously will give to Lee all sorts of generous terms, as I mentioned, including paroles to everyone that is of sort of the enlisted people. The officers, not so clear, but paroles that allow them free travel home so they can plant their crops. Those who have sidearms are allowed to keep their sidearms. I could go on and on about the generous terms. They make sure that men have food because they're extra rations, so let's give them extra rations. What we have here in this scene also is just a scene that looks like two men making a treaty as equals. And I think that's hugely important in terms of the mythology of Appomattox and why this image is so important. Because it's the bloodiest war and brutal in so many ways, and yet that it could come to this clean ending. I mean, it is a very clean image of equals, effectively, agreeing to end a war. That's an incredible thing, and so it's a powerful idea until you realize, well, wait a minute, that didn't actually end the war completely. One issue to understand here is that what Lee is doing is he's surrendering the Army of Northern Virginia. That's one army, the most famous army. Lee's definitely the most famous commander. But there are other armies in the field. Joe Johnston's army is still in North Carolina. They're pinned, basically, by William Tecumseh Sherman and his army. West of the Mississippi, there are 50,000 Confederate troops. Even if they get word of these surrenders, it's going to take a long time for that word to go there. In the meantime, they're a threat. So much a threat that months after this event, Grant will order Sheridan west with 50,000 Union troops to go and deal with possible continued warfare west of the Mississippi and the possibility of warfare on the border with Mexico, because there in Mexico there are French troops under Napoleon III who there's great fears that they might start a border war. So this is all happening well after Appomattox. Now I'm just going to jump ahead quite a bit to August 20th of 18... Well, actually, I do want to actually spend one moment, and I'll come back to this in a second, but I want to just introduce you to another image from Appomattox because we never see it. We so rarely see it. So this is the image from the day after April 9th. This is April 10. Grant rides out to the Confederate lines. Lee gets word that he's coming, so Lee rides out, and the two men meet on horseback, and they talk. Now, unlike the day before, where there were many witnesses and people heard what they said and wrote down what was said, in this meeting on April 10th, only Grant's records tell us what was said. They are the only reliable records. What was said here? I'll come back to that. But I just want to set this up because already we have this kind of, well, if the war was over on April 9, why do they have to keep on talking? And events continue. I do want to introduce you to an end of the timeline, if you will, of sorts. August 20th, 1866, not a day that we should necessarily know about or remember, but this is the legal end of the American Civil War. And I emphasize legal, which doesn't have to hold your mind as the absolute end. So on this date, President Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor, will declare that the insurrection is at an end and that peace, order, and tranquility and civil authority now exist throughout the U.S. It didn't actually, peace did not exist. If it did exist, then why, when Grant takes office as president, does he say, let us have peace? So peace didn't really exist. But Johnson is declaring that peace does exist. And he's declaring that the war is over because he wants all the Union troops out of the South. By this point, Johnson is at war with Congress. Congress wants to use war powers to keep troops in the South on occupation duty, but they're doing more than just occupation duty. They are actually at war with certain insurgent groups, including the Ku Klux Klan. People are getting killed. So this, like all insurgencies, these are dangerous and lethal engagements that are going on. But here's Johnson declaring a line, if you will, here the war ends. And so legally this becomes the end. So if I go back to where I started with these pensions and all this, those guys who joined in early April and served in the U.S. Army actually had a reasonable claim to be Civil War soldiers, because this is what the War Department eventually determined, that for the sake of pensions and other kinds of legalistic things, August 20th, 66 would be the end. But there are bigger issues to think about here, which is, as I said earlier, can a president simply declare a war over? And if it's not the president, who does? Okay, wars are supposed to end by treaties. That's the only way we hear about wars ending in the U.S. Constitution, by treaties. Well, the problem with that is that the Civil War is not a war between nations in the view of the U.S. government. In the view of the U.S. government, the Confederacy is a group of rebels, insurrectionaries. The Confederate nation is not a nation. This is Lincoln's point throughout, for all sorts of reasons, including the fact that if it's not a nation, it can't be recognized by a foreign country. So it's not a nation. Can't make a treaty with it. You really aren't supposed to make treaties with rebels. You're supposed to punish them. So that creates sort of interesting issues. As I mentioned, there was fighting that continued even after this point. We kind of knew this was coming, a lot of people knew this was coming on the day after that April 9th surrender. So if we go back to what was spoken of on that day, what actually was said between Lee and Grant on the day after the famous signing? Grant is saying to Lee that he wants Lee to get in touch any way he can with Jefferson Davis. Now here I need to explain that Richmond fell about 6 days earlier. Davis and the Confederate cabinet left Richmond on a train heading south into the interior, into southern Virginia, and then eventually into North Carolina. And this becomes the Confederate government on wheels. So that Jefferson Davis never says the Confederacy surrenders. He's issuing statements on the run about the state of the Confederacy. He's issuing orders to Joe Johnston and to Edmund Kirby Smith west of the Mississippi. So for him, right, the war's a lie. Grant is saying to Lee, get in touch with him and try to get him to surrender. And if he issues a surrender, then all the armies will surrender, and that will end the war. Lee says, no, I won't do it. That he can't do it because it's not his place to tell a superior officer what to do. The real reason that's going on is that Lee knows that Davis will not surrender. And it's true, he never surrenders. Even after capture, he never admits Confederate defeat. He's captured on May 10th. But then comes an interesting statement once Lee says no. Lee says to Grant, I suspect it may take your army marching back and forth across the country 3 or 4 times before the fighting's over. That's a heck of a statement. So whereas we think of like the fighting being over the day before when all the signing happens, no, this is Lee predicting the future. And he's not far off, right? Because if you count insurgencies, or by whether they're guerrillas or local forces, whatever you want to call them, those do continue. And they continue in various forms, sometimes in pitched battle form, long after Appomattox. 3 or 4 years, sure. That's what's being predicted. And Grant doesn't dispute it. Grant just says, I hope whatever happens, it can happen with a minimum of bloodshed. So in a way, they could see this coming. My book, then, is a way of taking us through from, I mean, actually it's a broader time spectrum, but if you will, a spectrum of endings. Thinking about Appomattox as one ending, I would argue the most famous ending, and I don't want to downplay it. It's a hugely important moment. Thinking about that proclamation of Johnson on the right as another ending. So a lot of my book then takes us into this stuff that happens between. But then it goes beyond 66 a little bit because I actually have to get to something like an answer because Congress rejects Johnson and his proclamation that says the war's over. So then I have to get to, well, if that's not good, what can we say is the end of the war? So a lot of the book fills this in. And I'll just give a couple examples of where, these are things that people who really know about the Civil War will know this already. I think people in this room will know this already. But some who don't may not know that, yes, there were actual battles after Appomattox. One way to think about the end of the war is to ask ourselves, when is the last battle of the war? And that should be an easy answer. Find the last true battle and then it's over. The problem is, like, when I tried to find that and sought the end by looking at this question of when is the last battle, there are 2 major contenders. And not 1, but 2, and they're separated by a month. So a lot of people would say that the Battle of Columbus, Georgia is the last battle. That's about a week after the Appomattox Surrender. That's a real battle, no question about it. There's armies involved. The official last battle, under the official records of the War of the Rebellion, those 100+ volumes, is actually Palmito Ranch, which is in another month after that, which is on the border between Texas and Mexico. Why are people fighting there? Is a really good question. And why were people there in the first place? Why are there U.S. soldiers stationed there is a good question. And it has to do with not only the fact that there are Confederate troops in Texas, quite a few as I mentioned, but also that there is the real potential of Mexico getting involved in this war, or the U.S. getting involved in a Mexican invasion. So this is another reason, as I mentioned, that there's action going on here. So both of these sites claim to be the last battle. Go to either site, and you'll find a plaque commemorating the last battle of the Civil War. The way that Columbus, Georgia deals with this is by saying the last important land battle. So that's stuff that happened in Texas, not important. But if you know the official records of the War of the Rebellion, as many of you do, you can actually see the battle report from Palmito Ranch, which comes out in May. And the editors write at the end, this is the record of the last battle of the war. So take that for whatever it's worth. Another way to think about endings is, well, we know that a lot of holdouts occur. That is, battles might happen, but that doesn't mean people necessarily surrender. So another way to think about this is, when is the last surrender? That turns out, obviously, it's, as I've already said, it's not Appomattox. Appomattox may be the most famous surrender, but certainly not the last. It would be not until the end of April that Joe Johnston would surrender. A story which in itself is complicated by the fact that the first try at surrender, the first terms are disapproved by Washington, so they have to go back to the table and try again. After that surrender, which is in Johnston's army, is of a similar size to Lee's, then you have a series of surrenders over that sort of take us to Galveston, the surrender of June 2nd, of Kirby Smith and the Trans-Mississippi Confederates. Although, does that really mean that everyone west of the Mississippi was surrendered? Because people still held out even though the surrender had occurred. Kirby Smith himself doesn't stick around. In fact, he didn't even show up to the surrender. He and a bunch of people headed towards Mexico, including Joe Shelby, quite famously. And some of those people really thought that they would get to Mexico, maybe form alliances with some of Napoleon's troops, maybe fight for Napoleon and secure Mexico against the Wallonistas. And then in return, Napoleon would lend his troops and they could cross back over the border and start the war again. So this is something I read about as well, these kind of dreams of a continuing warfare that will become a continental war. Meanwhile, the Grant and others are hoping for a continental war too, to be provoked, so they can send thousands of U.S. troops into Mexico. That's something that many have been hoping for a while. In terms of holdouts, beyond these official surrenders, there's a number. I'll just mention two quickly. First, the last Confederate general to surrender army is Stan Watie, who surrenders in Oklahoma. It was present-day Oklahoma. It was then called Indian Territory. Stan Watie is a Cherokee leader, but he's also a brigadier general for the Confederacy. So he surrenders not until June 23rd. This is a modern painting done of the surrender, which then raises a whole set of issues, right? What is a Cherokee doing as a brigadier general for the Confederacy? And I'm interested in that question, which is a specific question, but I'm interested even more in the larger question. Wait a minute, where are all the Native American squabbles and fights and battles in all of this stuff? Native American warfare, war between U.S. and Native Americans especially, is going on during the Civil War period. And it's being fought often by the same U.S. troops who signed up to fight Confederates, who've now been deployed elsewhere to fight Native Americans. So how does that fit in? I have a number of regiments I discuss in the book, sign up to fight the Confederates, and then end up being deployed to the Great Plains to fight the Sioux, or to New Mexico to fight the Navajo, or to keep them incarcerated effectively within the Bosque Redondo, which is the forest that they've been relocated to from their homelands in New Mexico, in the territory of New Mexico. when we think about these so-called Indian wars, right, we tend to locate those in time after the war, after the Civil War. But it doesn't work. It doesn't even work on a timeline. So, and I'll show you that in a moment. So if the Native American struggles are actually part of a war going on, it's obviously not the same war. It's not a war against the Confederacy. But for some it is. For Stan Watie, he's fighting for the Confederacy. But what do we do with that? Those guys who I mentioned in the beginning who signed up in early 1866 and who actually had a good case for getting a Civil War pension, why did they sign up? They signed up knowing that they would be deployed to the Great Plains to fight the Native Americans in the Great Plains. Now, decades later, they're applying for Civil War pensions. The last holdout, and my favorite story, is the Shenandoah, the Confederate ship that is deployed to do as much damage as possible to the New England whaling fleet. New Bedford is affected deeply, deeply by the Shenandoah. So the idea here that the Confederacy had is during wartime you try to obviously win battles, right? But you also do as much economic destruction as you can to the enemy. So the idea was to get a ship, they buy a ship from the English, they outfit it to become a warship. It has its steam-powered and sail-powered, it's cutting-edge technology. It sails around Africa, docks in Australia, and the idea is to get to the North Pacific by the summer, because that's where the whale hunting is, by the whalers of New England. And if you can fire those ships, set them on fire, capture them or sink them, then you've done as much economic destruction as you can. The Shenandoah does that. The Shenandoah gets, in June, it arrives close to the Bering Strait. It will, in 1 week, it'll cause more destruction against the Union economy than is caused in any other week during the war. And it's the New Bedford whalers that are the most affected by the Shenandoah. Often in wartime, you get these situations where, what I sometimes jokingly say, where people don't get the memo, right? So how could they know on the Shenandoah that the war was over? There was no way. After doing all this destruction and they start sailing southeast, they start running into ships, and the people say, you know, Lee surrendered, Richmond fell. And they say, that can't be true, this is lies, propaganda. Finally, they run into a ship that has newspapers with those headlines. And then they realize, oh, this is really bad because it means we've been causing our destruction after perhaps formal war might be over, which means technically we're pirates. Pirates have to be hanged under the laws of international nations, international law. And so where are we going to go? Where are we going to die? So they end up in Liverpool, seeking English protection, getting English protection, and England and America getting a lot of a sort of short diplomatic tiff about what's going to happen to the sailors aboard, but they're protected. No one is tried or hanged in the Shenandoah, as opposed to other people who are tried. And I'm not going to say anything about that right now, but there are people who are tried and even executed. Jefferson Davis is not one of those. He was indicted, not tried. He ends up in prison for a couple of years, but he's never put to trial. So if you want to ask about that, I'm happy to talk about those, because here's another way to think about endings of war. Often we think about endings of war, we look for the punishment dealt to the perpetrators. Who perpetrated the war? Should there be war crimes tribunals or some kind of trial of the perpetrators? This often happens in war. Now here I'm thinking about World War II especially, and the trials of Germans and Japanese leaders and hangings. And so that's often not necessarily marking the end of the war, but we associate with the end of the war. Did that happen with the Civil War? Nothing like that happened. There were some really famous hangings, but there were really only two, and only one was truly famous. Jefferson Davis is never hanged, even though he's the one that a lot of Union leaders most want to see punished as having been the President of the Confederacy. So here I've just tried to sort of touch on some of the things that the book goes at, and to sort of introduce you to the complexity of the question at hand. These are all images of the Shenandoah's voyage. And so this is June of '65. Then it slowly is going to make its way across all the way to Liverpool. I have now filled in some stuff in this timeline. I'm not going to go through this. I haven't covered everything on this timeline. But it's not just filling in the timeline. It's introducing questions, some of which I can answer, some of which will remain open and debatable. And that's what interests me as a historian. There's the questions that are interesting, where more work can be done, where we kind of open our eyes and say, wow, I hadn't thought about things that way. How might that apply to present day? How might the present day inform how we think about that question way back in the past? Here's a timeline of major surrenders, right up to Johnson's proclamation of ending the war. I've already told you that you complicate that timeline when you add in Native American issues. So here, I'm not going to go through these, but you have the surrender of Stan Guati, which I mentioned. But in summer, you have a major expedition, the Powder River expedition into the Sioux. These are U.S. Army troops led by people generals whose names you would recognize, commanding troops who signed up to the Confederacy. These Union troops, many of them said we should go home because the war against the Confederacy is over. They're told by the War Department, no, it's not over. When you sign up as a U.S. troop after the first year, roughly, your typical term of enlistment is 3 years or till the end of the war. That's what your enlistment papers say, 3 years or till the end of the war. So a lot of these people who are sent west say, we're done, end of war. They even leave, they go home. They are arrested as deserters and told, no, you signed up for 3 years at the end of the war. Technically, the war is not over. You're still fighting. So how does this question really matter? Well, think about how it matters to those people and their family who are being told, you think the war is over, you're wrong. And you get mass desertions, mass arrests. Some of these arrests then leads to mass imprisonment in U.S. military prisons. How do you even measure or start thinking about the end of Indian wars? Well, there are treaties. 1866, there are major treaties, 1868. But then you have a mess because for a period in the 1870s, the War Department says we're not going to make any treaties with Native Americans anymore. How can you have an end of war if there's no treaty? So these are all questions that are relevant once you introduce this to the scene. But what I haven't mentioned anything about yet, and purposefully, just the last provocative bit I'll mention is, what in the world do we do about the fact that the war was not just a war against the Confederacy, maybe it's a war that involved Native Americans, but it is a war for emancipation. It had been declared as such, but certainly by the time Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln's second inaugural says that this war must go on until slavery is destroyed. He says it much better than I just said it. So if it's a war to destroy slavery, isn't the end of war that moment when you have attained the objective of the war? So isn't that a good way to look for the end of war? And if the end of war is not just bringing the southern states back in and having them swear oaths of loyalty, but actually destroying slavery, because after all that has now a war aim, then shouldn't that be on the timeline? And then you have this really significant challenge, because how in the world do you mark the end of slavery? My first book was on the 13th Amendment, which legally abolishes slavery. It's ratified in December of 1865. You can then add to this timeline, as I do here in purple, issues that are tied up in emancipation. I mentioned the 13th Amendment. That's December of 1865 when it's ratified. But that hardly ends white people treating black people as slaves. I mean, especially in places like Texas where the army can't touch them. So actual enslavement continues. How then do you mark the end of slavery? We have a federal holiday that marks Juneteenth, which is when a commander declares that slavery in Texas is over. So that's good to have a holiday that marks it, but at the same time, to say that June 19th, 1865 is when slavery ended, that doesn't work. We have, in purple here later on, we have acts passed by Congress that enforce emancipation. Now we're getting closer to an end, where we're saying that the Army is actually taking on the mission of making sure that slavery is in fact over. And in fact, that's what will continue into the 1870s. Under Grant as president, the Army will be used to crush the Klan in South Carolina, for example. This is part of the ongoing war, under one interpretation, right? So there it is, under one interpretation of thinking about how wars end. Under one interpretation, if you say the war can't end until slavery is truly destroyed, then you certainly can't use Appomattox as an endpoint. You certainly can't use Johnson's August 20th, 1866 proclamation. But if you want to define the war differently and say, for example, look, the biggest surrender of the most famous army by the most famous guy, Robert E. Lee, is the end, fine, that's okay. But then you just have to acknowledge that as your preferred endpoint, and that's the ending. But you can see the contention, you can see the debate. The date one chooses, or the date a nation chooses, defines the war. And I think this probably happens for other wars too. That when you locate the end of a war at a certain place and you define it a certain way, whether you mean to or not, you are defining the whole war. I'm fascinated by that phenomenon generally, but certainly for the Civil War. When you go to Appomattox today, you are met still with this sign. It's been redesigned, but the message is the same. We're our nation reunited. There's 4 main roads in. These are county signs. So you have to see this sign. And I just think it's so interesting that the signs exist. 160th anniversary just happened this past April, and I got to go and speak, and so that was fun. But I hope that you can now take away that Appomattox, you know, it still exists in my head as an endpoint. I'm still going to continue to use phrases like, well, after Appomattox, as shorthand for after the Civil War. Part of my brain will do that and say that. Part of my brain at the same time knows there's a problem. 2 very competing voices in my own brain. How do we deal with that? Welcome to humanity. So that's what this book is about. That's why, that's kind of where I've come to in thinking about this. And now I'm happy to take whatever questions you have. Thanks again for having me.
The picture you had there of Lincoln with
Yeah.
the pencil.
Yep.
Was that after the delegation from the South left? Because they had come there to negotiate.
Yeah. Well, it's a good question. So, yes, is the answer. It's after. You're talking, I think, about the Hampton Roads Conference, which is, well, I don't need to show them now. But in early February of 1865, 3 delegates from the Confederacy, right, come, and they come to talk to Lincoln or whoever. Now, that's a whole story unto itself, the Hampton Roads Conference. And it's a scene from Spielberg's movie on Lincoln, where you have Lincoln and Seward meeting with these 3 guys. Now, interestingly, it is on board the same boat, the River Queen, and it's not too far away. Hampton Roads more at the mouth of the James as opposed to City Point. So it's after. And that meeting ends quickly, because Lincoln says, sure, if you want to talk about peace, no problem. You have to agree right now that the Confederacy surrenders and that slavery is over. And he says, by the way, Congress has passed the resolution for the 13th, it's not the 13th Amendment yet, for the Anti-Slavery Amendment. It's gone to the states for ratification. This is a great surprise to those 3 Southerners who didn't know that. And so it changes the sort of whole way of thinking. The whole thing breaks up. So this comes later, and it's very different because that's a meeting between Union leaders and Confederate leaders. This is a meeting strictly of Union leaders, Lincoln and the Giants.
Yeah, thank you. I forgot my dates.
Yep.
I have a question. It's interesting. It's a word called non-resignation.
All right, for example, you have the dissolving of the English Empire. You have Irishmen that have decided that they don't want to be part of the empire. You have Scotland finally beginning to talk about withdrawing from the United Kingdom, resignation. They don't want to quit. I believe what's happening in the United States right now. You have parts of this country that are still not interested in resignation.
Do you mean resigning from the Civil War?
Right.
Okay.
Now, at the same time, is you have a situation where you brought up some interesting things. Grant made all kinds of decisions during his presidency that got everybody really upset. And you brought up today, he was in that room and he clearly agreed with Lincoln on certain things. And this warped the way he acted as president. It haunts you on and on. And then I bring up the concept of federalization. We had no federalization until the Civil War. Federalization allowed the government to take on superpowers that allowed them to do whatever was necessary. We are still struggling in this country over this today. I just want to know if you want to make any comments on this.
So for those who couldn't hear it, these are some of the most important and lingering questions that I continue to think about that are in the book. Let me start with the narrow issue, Grant. Even that's complicated, right? So the Grant of Appomattox is Grant who is going along with Lincoln and being kind to the South, right? Well, once we get into post-Lincoln, things change. One thing that I didn't mention at all, by the way, is the fact that Lincoln gets assassinated. I don't think this is news to you, but it changes the dimensions of the war and the after-war. Because Lincoln gets assassinated just days after Appomattox. One of the things that happens then is there's just the assumption that somehow the Confederacy must be behind it. It's a wartime act. So there's a lot of people that want to take that grasp of war idea, and eventually that's where Grant ends up. By 66, that's where he is. He ends up at odds with President Johnson. The Grant of Appomattox, the Grant who was going along with let him up easy, is the Grant who will become somebody who's like, no, we actually want war powers. We want to use the federal army in the South and keep them there until the civilian governments of the southern states are basically aligned in the way we want them. We are going to use war power. That means the war still exists, at least somehow legally. So one question is, what happened to Grant? And then when he becomes president, he backs off on that quite a bit. That's a whole other phase. So Grant himself is a complicated person going back and forth, and I would say representing someone who's wrestling with these same questions on the spot and whose mind might be changing as circumstances change. But your other question, which you framed in terms of the phrase non-resignation, which I like, which is like a refusal to resign. I use often the phrase die-hard Confederates, right? The people who don't want to give up, never give up in some certain cases. The most common question I've gotten since this book came out in March, and I've given talks, and definitely the most common question I got, and even when I was writing the book, is I would tell people I'm writing a book about the end of the Civil War, and they would say, oh, did it end? Right? And so I often get this question like, well, where are we actually today in the end of the war? Or are we on like the verge of another civil war? I have to deal with this in the book. I can deal with it now just by saying the war that began in 1860-61, however you want to date it, whether secession, Fort Sumter, whatever, that war came to an end. And my book tries to emphasize the many different endpoints. That said, there are elements today that absolutely bear a direct relation to that. it isn't necessarily that they're fighting for a Confederate nation, right? But some of the people who are opposed. But they haven't necessarily accepted the resolution of that first Civil War. But there's more direct ways. And now we come to a part of your question, which is federalization. Federalization. So here I'll just say a few words and then I'll stop. What you're talking about with federalization is a few different things, but let's focus very directly on federalizing local troops, militias, right? So let us go back to April 1861. What does Lincoln do? In reaction to the firing on Fort Sumter, what does he do? He calls up 75,000 militiamen. This is hugely important. The U.S. regular army at this time is, depending on the count, between 14 and 16,000. And Lincoln's been told that regular army is not enough. You got to have a volunteer army. So he calls for 75,000 militiamen. This is federalizing the militia, which is allowable in certain circumstances. What circumstances? Well, then you have to go to different laws at different times. But, so I won't go down that road yet. Lincoln believed he was acting legally when he called up the militia. There were those, many in the South, you might imagine, who thought he was acting illegally, unconstitutionally, by calling up the militiamen. Many of you know that Lincoln approached Lee at this moment, or right around this moment, and said, will you agree to command the U.S. troops because, you know, you're this well-known military thinker and you have experience from the U.S.-Mexican War? And Lee says no, and, you know, he goes with Virginia. But one of the reasons to understand that decision is because when Lincoln calls up the militia, he's calling it the militia of all the states. I mean, technically, the Virginia militiamen are supposed to report for duty as U.S. federal troops. That's intolerable. That is just intolerable to people who are supporting what's going on in secession. And by that point, once Lincoln calls up the troops, that's the thing, that move of federalization, that turns Virginia to the side of the secessionists. Now, jump to the end of the war. All right, you have a million men, roughly, let's say beginning of 1865, who are in Union uniform. And 20,000 plus, closer to 30, are what we call regular army. And then the rest are volunteers. Very hasty, but not nearly complete mustering out of the volunteers. But you've still got an army by the end of 1865 that's roughly 80,000 plus men. That's big. Again, if the whole army had been like 15,000 roughly, you have an army that's much bigger. Most of it's still volunteers. How big is the army supposed to be? Lincoln started trying to work this out before he died. He didn't know he was going to die, but he took notes trying to figure out how big should the regular army actually be. He starts coming up with ratios. But the bigger question for us is, how long are you going to keep these people federalized before you let them go? And so this becomes very much a part of my book. It's very much a part of Reconstruction. You cannot, I believe, I fully believe this, you cannot achieve reform at the level of changing state governments without guns. You just can't, without the threat of force. And it's the threat of force that will get the southern states to change. And of course, when you pull the army out, that will then allow southern state governments to go back the way they were. So what ends up being in place is a federalized system where, under certain circumstances, you can federalize, you can use the army, which can involve volunteers, not just regular army, in civilian territory. That's what Reconstruction is. It's using the U.S. Army in domestic territory. This is why it's so relevant to today. Los Angeles, right? Washington, D.C. is a little bit more complicated because it's part of federal jurisdiction. But Los Angeles, Memphis, whatever cities are to come, where troops are being deployed. And they say, no, 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 that's the National Guard, that's something different. Not actually, no, the National Guard claims that they are today's militiamen. They're not quite, because they're created by a whole set of legislation at the end of 1800s, but they're as close as you get to an actual militia, which is, and again, if you think about it, right, they have to be called up by the states typically, but they can be federalized under certain circumstances. All of that's, if you want a law, look up 1878, the Posse Comitatus law. That's the crucial law. And if you haven't heard about it, you will hear about it. It'll be tested. The whole principle behind the Posse Comitatus Act is the U.S. Army should not be used domestically, except under the most serious emergencies, right? Except. That's the exception. So what are those emergencies? And more important probably for us, who gets to decide whether there's an emergency or not? Right? Is it the president? And if it's not the president, who else could it be? Do the courts get to say to the president, no, not an emergency? We're not there yet, and I'm not sure we'll get there, but I think we'll probably get there. We're getting there in other ways, because the Alien Enemies Act is related, and the Fifth Circuit out of Texas has issued an opinion that whatever's going on with gang members from Latin America doesn't amount to an invasion or a predatory incursion, so you can't use the army. But that doesn't get us to the Posse Comitatus Act and this larger principle issue, the principle issue. It was definitely the case that people said what happened during the war ideally shouldn't happen again. The use of massive federal troops in the South, or in any place. So only under emergency circumstances, like strike breaking, where a lot of people do that right through the 20th century. So that's a long-winded answer, but I just wanted to say why this issue matters to me still, even months after the book has come out. And I keep on saying, wow, I'd have to rewrite sections now. But it's relevant.
I think your timeline speaks rather clearly of what the post-war would have looked like in today's world had Lincoln survived.
How so? What do you think?
In a much more positive, defined way. I have faith that he had a plan, especially for Reconstruction, and to make it work. And once that ended, we had no chance. And then we didn't solve any problem in the war.
Lincoln's death is really important for more than two reasons. But one, you don't have Lincoln, so executing Reconstruction in a better way is gone because Johnson's, I'm sorry, I don't think I'm going to upset anyone by saying that I do not regard President Andrew Johnson as a good president. But the other thing is that because of the way he dies, right, the first president to be assassinated, that changes the train, right? And it changes rage, it creates rage in the North, so that kind of reconciliatory spirit that infuses Appomattox is now, it's not gone, but it's going to be harder to reclaim, right? And so it affects things on the ground as well, which I go into in the book, on the way that repercussions are being, atrocities are being committed to civilians and so forth. What would have been different had Lincoln lived? I'm not sure. I don't think he had a plan that was like holistic. Lincoln rarely did. This is what he was good at, was looking at the terrain of possibilities and picking the best one that existed. And that's what he would have done. I don't know what that would have been. I don't know what that would have been. And I do not know, here's going back to your good question, what is to be done with people, the non-resignation people, right? The people who refuse to surrender under any terms and say, we'll just go underground, right? We will be insurrectionaries or insurgencies. You could call a Klan such an insurgency, but the Klan is just one of many such groups. At the local level, there are many such groups who, they may not be fighting for a Confederate nation, but they have not resigned from the fight. What do you do about them? And this is a problem for all leaders. Grant, as general, had interesting solution where he said, this is the first wave, he says to these guerrillas, either surrender by this date, July 1st, or else we can treat you as hostiles, you can be hanged on sight. That gets a lot of people to surrender. Would Lincoln have been willing to go along with that kind of policy? He might have. He might have. It doesn't sound Lincoln-esque, but he might have said, you know, that's not a bad idea. Use the carrot and the stick, and there's the stick. So I don't know what Lincoln would have done. He would have done better than Johnson. The problem is that's setting the bar really low. So but I do think it would have worked out better.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
Will you be giving this presentation at the Lincoln Forum in Gettysburg this year?
Yes, with different twists. The Lincoln Forum is in November, and I'm speaking at the Lincoln Forum. It'll be a little bit more Lincoln-centric, even though Lincoln dies. You know, that I set up this whole point that Lincoln is having this meeting on March 28th, and he will be dead, right, in less than 3 weeks. But every day of that period is an extraordinary day, which I didn't get to go into, including Lincoln being in Richmond, right, when Richmond falls, and speaking to Confederates. So it's a little bit more of that side of the story and more to this issue of like, all right, what would Lincoln have done? Let's look at what Lincoln actually did in this very short period of time, and that's telling. So I'll do a little bit more with that. But yeah, that is still about. The other thing is that by November, when the Lincoln Forum happens, other things will have happened in this country that will sort of create different reference points for me. I just don't know what they are. But things are happening every day that relate. I shouldn't laugh because this is kind of serious when you have federal troops going into cities. Whether you agree with it or not, it is something that basically hasn't been done with this kind of protracted way, right, since Reconstruction. It has been done, but always time limited and targeted. And so this is different. And I'm not trying to make a value judgment, but to say it makes Reconstruction all the more relevant, I think. Any other questions? Thank you all very much.